Good evening, all. My name is Dr. Nimish Shah. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar this evening. Thank you for joining. We've got Professor Mark Torbert, who's the Clinical Director and Consultant in Palliative Medicine at Velindre Hospital, talk to us tonight about DNACPR and advanced care planning. I think this is a really important topic, and I'm really pleased that Mark's had a lot of involvement in setting up the advanced care planning in Wales, and I'm really pleased that he could be presenting tonight. Without further ado, Mark, if you're there, I'm going to hand over to yourself.
So I am surprised that so many people have turned up tonight, I must say. It's not it's not the most enticing subject for a Wednesday night when the weather is nice outside. By ways of introduction, I'm a palliative care consultant. I work in Llandoch Hospital and I work in Velindre as well. I'm lead for advanced care planning and DNACPR in Wales for my sins. And part of the reason for that was because I, prior to that, always was having a go at the DNACPR form and a pop at the DNACPR policy. I was a fairly outspoken critic. So I think they kind of got fed up with me. And one day I got a phone call from the deputy CMO, Chris Jones, and he said, Mark, I want you to lead on DNACPR. And I said no twice, but in the end, he got me around to it. So if there's any outspoken critics tonight, I've asked Nimish to note down the names, and I may then approach you to have a little go at it yourself in future, because it's a complicated area, and we'll discuss it. So on the screen in front of you, you can see the All Wales DNACPR form and the patient information leaflet as well. A lot of you will be familiar with it. I've got it here as well on the screen. Yeah, it's move on to sort of 2021. So the policy was launched as an All Wales policy back in 2015 by Vaughan Gethin, who was Deputy Health Secretary at the time. And move on to 2021. We've moved on a little bit, but not as far as I would like, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit. We've got a lot of resources here, which have been provided by the NHS Collaborative and the Life Care Implementation Board. We've got an official website, which I'll keep mentioning during the presentation today. www.wales.nhs.uk/DNACPR, and the same address /AFCP has a lot of resources for you in terms of the policy, some information videos, some patient-facing videos, and the entire policy as well, which is about 32 pages or so. I know that seems a long read, but as you'll see during this talk today, I'd expect anyone who fills in a DNACPR form to have at least an understanding or basic understanding of the policy. Where some of this started, so go back in time again a little bit, 10 years back, 2011, and the Tracy case, which some of you may be aware of. Janet Tracy was a lady with a lung cancer, but no known metastatic disease as such, was involved in a road traffic accident, had a quite nasty injury to her spine, was admitted to ITU, was very, very unwell, but able to communicate. And as time went on, she started getting a little bit better, but was quite frail. And one day, one of the junior doctors mentioned to one of the junior doctors mentioned to one of her relatives that they wouldn't be going around jumping around on her chest if the worst thing happened. And she sort of dismissed it a little bit, the comment, and she sort of nodded her head and went home. And then they had a discussion as a family. And then a few days later, they sought some clarification as to what had gone on. And the consultant spoke to them and said that a DNACPR form had been placed on Janet's notes. And Janet, who was completely compos mentis, but unable to move very much, was very upset about this. This ITU environment around here had become her entire world. She developed a trust in the nursing staff and the doctors who were around her. It was a frightening experience for her because she was worried that things had been withheld from her. And so lots of discussions ensued. The DNACPR form was initially withdrawn, and then she got more unwell a few days later, and then it was reinstated again in discussion with the family and with her as well. She subsequently died, but the family were not happy with the communication because it had caused Janet significant harm, psychological harm, and they took her to court. And in the initial court case in the High Court, their case lost. So the judge ruled, well, DNACPR is a medical decision, and unfortunately this situation arose and should have perhaps been communicated better, but it is a medical decision. Fast forward a little bit, they took it to the next step in the legal review, which is one court higher, the Court of Appeal. And the Court of Appeal is where everything changed, and where I think our medical lives changed, and where things then sort of moved forward significantly, because the Court of Appeal ruled in their favor. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the legal issues that came out of this. But yeah, just one of the take-home messages today is ask not, it's surely just a medical decision, isn't it? And that is that. But do we have to discuss DNACPR decisions and forms that we place in the person's medical record? And so I'm going to read to you a little bit about the case, and you can access this all online. So Lord Justice Longmore and Lord Justice Ryder, and the entire case is there. You can download it as a PDF if you're interested. It is actually quite interesting. I know I'm probably someone who's a little bit too interested in this topic, but I'm going to read you a little bit in it because actually it's quite useful knowledge and learning as we go along. So key findings in the Tracy ruling. The Court of Appeal ruled that patients should be consulted in relation to advanced DNACPR decisions, save in exceptional circumstances, and that Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the right to respect for private and family life, is engaged by the decision to impose a DNACPR. There needs to be a convincing reason not to involve a patient in a DNACPR decision. For a patient not to be consulted about a DNACPR decision, the clinician would have to consider that to do so is likely to cause a patient to suffer physical or psychological harm. So they use this word harm quite specifically. Distress alone would not be sufficient, which is interesting. The clinical view that treatment will be futile is not a sufficient ground not to consult. In addition, an advanced DNACPR decision must be made in accordance with a clear and accessible policy, which we have in Wales. We've got the All Wales policy. This means that local policies should be available and clearly directed and disseminated. So that went out in 2011. Happy to say that Wales have an All Wales DNACPR policy. England don't. But I want to come back to the issue of harm versus distress, which is an interesting one. So as doctors, and I remember discussing this at the time when the court case came out, a lot of the consultant colleagues and GP colleagues were saying, oh my God, we're going to cause lots of distress to these 90-something-year-olds, and they're quite frail, and we're going to have this discussion, etc., etc. And yes, I mean, in our clinical practice, I think the last thing we want to do is cause distress and cause issues, cause worry to people. The law states that distress alone is not a sufficient excuse for the conversation if you feel that a DNACPR decision is important and it's actually only physical or psychological harm. Now, you might ask me what I define as harm in this sort of situation. And for me, harm would be something that is beyond 48 hours of thinking about it, worrying about it a little bit, but coming to a conclusion that perhaps the discussion was a good one and an informed one as well. Now, the next section I'm going to read in this court case contains a lot of legal terminology and double speak, and but it's still an interesting one, so bear with me. In my view, this is Justice Ryder. Doctors should be wary of being too ready to exclude patients from the process on the grounds that their involvement is likely to distress them. So distress and harm again. Any patients may find it distressing to discuss the question with a CPR should be withheld from them in the event of a cardiorespiratory arrest. If, however, the clinician forms the view that the patient will not suffer harm if she is consulted, the fact that she may find the topic distressing is unlikely to make it inappropriate to involve her. I I mean, I'm not originally from the United Kingdom, so I had to read that sentence about 4 times to understand it, because there's a lot of double sort of negatives in it. Recognize that these are difficult issues which require clinicians to make sensitive decisions, sometimes in very stressful circumstances. I would add that the court should be very slow to find that such decisions, if conscientiously taken, violate a patient's right under Article 8 of the Convention. Now, I'm someone who, both in my previous life in general practice, but also as a junior doctor and now as a consultant, have pretty much weekly discussions about ceilings of treatment and DNACPR. And therefore, being more on the front line also means more people and more relatives have a pop at me in terms of writing complaints. And I must say, I've used this segment of the legal text in a few times in my defense when I've written back to the complaints manager. Not saying that you should do that, but I suspect a few of you may have also had feedback about this. And yes, it is a tricky one. Of course, we try and convey this very sensitively, but at the end of the day, this is a difficult decision to have, and it's not going to be sugar-coated in any shape or form. You can communicate it sensitively, but there is going to be some degree of distress when you have these conversations. I think if a doctor had this conversation with me, I would find it a bit distressing as well. But you come to terms with the issues at hand. You agree or you disagree, and it's really about harm. So forming an opinion of whether it's going to cause harm or not. So I've been writing a lot in terms of kind of patient-facing materials, and some of the stuff I've written, I've also been able to publish in places like The Guardian and some other sort of news outlets as well, because I feel it's actually there's a difference in the sort of hierarchies in terms of knowledge. It's taken me a long time to get even close to understanding all the intricacies of DNACPR and advanced care planning and communication and the legal aspects as well. So what hope in hell does a patient have who's just come into the really tricky healthcare situation and is suddenly faced with all these medics and doctors talking about this very, very complex issue. So I have provided some resources, and you can access some of these via the websites that I've promoted throughout this PowerPoint presentation, if you want to share them with patients who are interested. I was quite surprised that the consumer website has a big section on later life care. Actually, their topic area of DNACPR had a lot of inaccuracies, so I wrote to them and sort of made some suggestions, and then they let me kind of rewrite a large swathe of it. For instance, in legal terms, DNR is not a particularly useful abbreviation. Lots of people say DNR or DNAR. Actually, the legal terminology has to be DNACPR, because it's do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation, because resuscitation is a more vague term and can mean things like fluid resuscitation and very appropriate attempts at trying to make someone a little bit better. So that's just a bit of terminology for you, which you might or might not find helpful. Yes, some patient-facing resources as well, something I wrote in the BMJ, but I've also written with a number of my own patients and with carer representatives and patient carer groups as well. And in fact, the Advanced and Future Care Planning Group, which I chair, has a patient representative and has had several patient representatives who are very interested in this topic area. So, little recap of some of the important points thus far. We have an all-Wales DNACPR policy and form, love it or hate it. I used to hate it, now I'm in charge of it, and I've had a few goes at making it better. But these things are never perfect, I think. And one point I'd also like to get across is it's not about the form, actually. It's far more about the communication of the pertinent issues, and the form is just a communication afterthought in many ways. It's recognized across all settings, borders, community, hospital, hospice, outpatients, etc., etc. Do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation decisions must be discussed with patients or their proxies unless they have indicated they do not wish to be involved. or the discussion is likely to cause physical or psychological harm. Again, that's an individual assessment by the clinician or the team. And your wording should be very clear, and the discussion should be clearly documented in the medical notes, which is something I have a regular moan about, because there's nothing, one thing that is worse than no DNACPR form is a really crappily filled in DNACPR form with very little detail in it. Important to document your attempts your communication with the patient if that has happened, or your attempts to communicate with family members and proxy. There's a very interesting other court case where the attempts were not very clearly documented. So the junior doctor later in their defense said that they had tried to communicate and contact the family, but it wasn't written down anywhere as such, and it was in the very early hours of the morning. So always be clear, even if you can't get hold of someone and the decision needs to be made, you can still make the decision, but you should also clearly document that when you have attempted to do that. And by the way, the new form that came out at the beginning of this year actually makes it quite explicit that you should write that down if you read it. I always say to the juniors that I work with and colleagues as well, that you should elicit all views on different escalative measures. So if you have someone who's palliative and who's quite unwell, you might want to explore to them, for what reasons they might want to go in hospital. Or they might have just come out of hospital, been treated for pneumonia, been in there for 3 or 4 weeks, and you might say, do you want to do this again? Do you want to go through this whole process again, or is it something you wouldn't want to do? And decisions are quite mixed on that one. I've heard people in the community say, no, absolutely not. Am I going back into that hospital again? Do everything you can here in the community setting. Or they said, well, yeah, actually, I'd be quite okay with that. But once you start with that and you say, would you accept IV antibiotics? Would you accept IV fluids? Would you, for instance, accept a blood transfusion? Would you have your chemotherapy? Would you have your radiotherapy? And work your way up this sort of treatment ladder, as I call it, you can then end up with the sort of top measures a little bit later in the conversation, and it doesn't take long. And actually, sometimes people, when you explain it very well, will say, no, actually, that one I wouldn't want. I wouldn't want someone to revive me when I'm already dead. You've told me just now that I'd be eligible potentially for the chemo or for the IV antibiotics, but that is something, no, I wouldn't want that. So you're eliciting views. And another thing that I think is important, I sometimes see some of the junior doctors sit with a patient and they're trying to get the patient to make a decision about this, which sometimes, if you've got a very outspoken patient, can be appropriate, but I think it's sometimes quite inappropriate as well. I think a better approach to this is actually maybe conveying what you think, what the medical opinion is, what your medical opinion is in this situation, that in fact you don't think CPR would work or would actually be quite harmful in many ways, but that you want to sort of run that by them and you want to explore their views on this and whether their views differ. Okay, so I think that's quite an important point. So elicit their views, but come down with an opinion either way and explain why that is, rather than make them decide for CPR or not for CPR, which in a way is a wrong decision matrix anyway, because in a way you and the MDT have already concluded that CPR would probably not be successful in this palliative situation. And yeah, I mean, this is perhaps simplistic, but not hospitalize, if a patient is very clear on that, implies a sort of treatment ceiling in itself. But do be careful, because I sometimes hear people say that I never want to be admitted to Landoc Hospital or UHW or anywhere else. I want to stay at home. And then you ask them, well, what if you actually fell down the stairs and you actually hurt your ankle really bad and it started swelling? Would you still not want to go into hospital? And then the decisions change a little bit. So that's an important one as well. So it's never ever that straightforward and simple. Yeah. So I've done a few videos. If you go into YouTube and type in Talk CPR, or if you go to talkcpr.wales, we've done some videos with patients, patient representatives. Went through a hospital patient review group as well, and they're called the Talk CPR videos. Some of you may have seen them already, and it can be a useful way to kind of refresh your own memory in some of the top tips. I actually quite regularly need sort of a communication top up so that I don't get too jaded. In those videos, you'll see the treatment ladder approach that I talked about, elaborated on a little bit more. Yeah, it can be just a good little reminder, and they're not very long at all, so it won't take you much time. So remember, you are not going in to consult asking patient next of kin to decide CPR or DNACPR for you. You're expressing an opinion, a medical opinion, on likely low or no success of CPR, balanced against its harm, and then eliciting their views on what you've just said, in a sense, and what you and the team feel is the correct approach. Where there's a difference of views, always an interesting one, and I suspect some of you will have sort of come across this situation. It's good to discuss DNACPR as a team or as an MDT, or for example, at your monthly end-of-life care practice meetings or palliative care team meetings, or discussing it with the CNS or the doctor, palliative care doctor associated with the practice. Good practice to offer a second opinion. So that's what the GMT recommends. So where there's a different opinion, so you say there should be a DNACPR form. Patient says, I don't want one of those things placed in my notes, thank you very much. If you still feel very strongly about it, then organizing a second opinion from a local GP colleague, for instance, or consultant geriatrician, etc., is good practice and should be offered. Until then, we've had all these situations, and I get emailed a lot about these. Either leave for full consideration of CPR at point of arrest. So all well policy suggests sort of angles towards doing this, and the arriving team, unfortunately, and still has to make that decision whether to commence CPR, even in the absence of a form, or inform patient next of kin that you're placing your recommendations on DNACPR in the notes anyway. Bit extreme, but we have done that in the past as well, when it's been a medical decision and we've been pretty sure that CPR would actually cause a lot of damage and harm, and actually cause quite a lot of trauma to the staff as well in that situation. Are DNACPR forms legally binding? Little quiz question there, because I know Nimish is on the call, and I think Julie Keeley's on the call as well. I saw her name flash up there as well. But no, I'll pick on Nimish. Nimish, are DNACPRs legally binding?
Mark, that's not fair. I would probably say no, they're not.
Oh, that's correct. They're not legally binding, which surprises some people actually. Their guidance, they're part of the notes. They're communication from one clinician to another, in a sense. They're a letter, So, but of course, if there's a fully well filled in DNACPR form there somewhere, or a respect form, or whatever comes fluttered in, basically, clinician in the situation where they find someone in that situation has to make a quick assessment and take in all the evidence that floods in on them, basically. So, words from relatives and from other medics and other professionals, and forms that are thrust in the face, and has to make a quick decision. There is a form that is legally binding, and that's an ADRT form. Nimish, I don't know if you have seen many of these before, especially in the sort of the psych domain or something like that, where patients have actually gone through the effort of filling in one of these legally binding forms. Do you come across those much, or?
No, hardly any at all, really. Very, very few.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing more and more of them actually, and especially sort of in the neurological conditions. Basically, a lot of patients really take charge and want something like that. Quite a little patient anecdote on that in a moment, actually. So, but yeah, an ADRT, take it very seriously. Ask for photocopies to put in the notes and file, because it's legally binding and must be abided by. If it's properly filled in by the patient, signed by the patient, and it states that treatment is refused, even if it puts life at risk, and if the signature is witnessed, then you need to abide by that form. So interesting that an ADRT is actually more powerful than a DNACPR form. And also interesting that often junior doctors, when you ask them, oh yeah, there's some sort of ADRT form, but it's nowhere near the front of the notes where you can't actually find it. Sort of the first thing I pounce on if I hear it's there. And I think that's quite powerful is, as you all know, and you'll probably be involved, process quite often, lasting power of health and welfare. Can't be the property one, it has to be the health and welfare one. And if they make a treatment refusal on behalf of the patient that they are the sort of attorney to, and that person is incapacitated, then it's as powerful as if that person were refusing it themselves. It's as powerful as the patient waving their finger to you and saying, no, I'm not having that artificial feeding tube put in, or no, I'm not, I don't want CPR. Obviously that wouldn't happen, but you know what I mean. A nominated attorney cannot demand a treatment. That's important to know. So if no one can come along and say, I'm their attorney, they've lost capacity, now I want you to give them CBT oil. So it doesn't work that way. It works for refusals. I'll put the link in there again. I've put them into abandonment in the bottom of the slides as well. But Wales.nhs.uk/AFCP has a lot of the resources in there. So important to have those as well. Also, I mean, very important to note as well that we cannot have a blanket approach towards this issue. I mean, colleagues of mine in England, and when I've been talking to them in general practice, I've sort of said, well, it got quite bad during the pandemic. What happened was that I got phone calls from the nursing home saying that 3 patients in the nursing home didn't have a DNACPR form or didn't have a respect form, and that was all it was basically. So and the same goes for learning disabilities and autism and things like that. Completely inappropriate for your first thought to be that that person should have a DNACPR form, and I think that's been criticized quite heavily. And I'll talk a little bit about the recent CQC report for England as well. I mean, I often say that CPR itself as a procedure is quite selective and discriminatory if you look at it. And if you look at some of the meta-analyses and the data on this, as I have, then success rates of CPR in patients with metastatic cancer, and I often quote this to patients, is 1.8% in one meta-analysis, which was a really, really big one as well. And can patients really express a view on this without knowing as much as we do in knowing some of these stats and some of these figures? They look at House MD and they look at casualty and Holby City and programs like that, and they think, well, most people will probably be all right. The doctors are pretty good, trust my GP is very good at CPR. I'm sure he'll get me out of this, and the next day I'll be walking out of the hospital again. Of course, it isn't like that. But one thing to think about sometimes is when people have ICD devices, which will fire off. This is specifically for a cardiac arrest situation, where someone will go flip into VF or pulseless VT. And of course, that constitutes a form of CPR, and it can be quite effective. We had a lung cancer patient once who just been diagnosed with quite advanced lung cancer, metastatic disease, but he'd had this ICD device for about 10 years. And I sort of talked to him because he had a lovely, nicely filled in DNACPR form, but no one had thought about the ICD device basically. And it can fire up to 40 times in an arrest. So we talked about it for a long time. And he said, no, I wanted to switch it off, basically. But then I must have done a really bad job explaining it, because he thought me switching it off would mean that he would just kind of drop down, basically. And of course, I said, no, it's only there to basically give you a shock if you were to go into a wrong rhythm. And so we talked that through. But that's an important one to maybe even note on the DNACPR form, or have a chat with the cardiologist or the ICD team. More detail on that in the policy as well, if you read it. And yeah, I always say, please write as much detail as you can onto the DNACPR form itself. The newer forms I'll show you in a moment have actually a little bit of space for free text as well. Yeah, I constantly change the way I sort of approach this and how I go in. I used to go in as a junior doctor in City Hospital in Birmingham is where I started out, with a massive agenda, and kind of, nurses had instructed me to go in and talk about this topic on a Saturday or Sunday. It wasn't even my team. And of course it went wrong a lot of the time, basically, and people took it the wrong way. But as I said, you all have your personal styles. I probably learn a lot from you all individually as well. Recently, I've kind of started going in what matters most to you, especially towards the end of life, as a sort of opening question. When you get more unwell, what do you want us to do? And I'm also started going in when people are feeling a little bit better. So conversely, so sometimes I go in and someone's just been in hospital for a few weeks, but they're recovering and they're about to go home, and I might say, look, you're feeling better now, and so it might seem a strange thing to bring up now, but what's your attitude towards having some of these treatments again? And then I take them up the treatment ladder and talk them through the different things. And it's quite surprising how many people just sort of agree and say, no, wouldn't be for me. So yeah, that's kind of the main gist on that one, and we do recommend getting lasting power of attorney in again. Just a little clip of one of the Talk CPR videos, which you find on YouTube, but also on the talkcpr.wales website. Here I was helped by some Falmouth students. They did a fantastic video for me completely for free. In return, because I'd spent 2 days down there sort of talking to them about medical topics, and their lecturers are very involved in kind of getting them to design and create video content for medical professionals that goes beyond the sort of rather drab patient information leaflet. And this has been accessed many times by quite a few patients, and actually has really good feedback as well. So feel free to be confident in using it. And here's some of the resources as well. I also recommend the advancedcareplan.org.uk resource to have a little look at. There's lots of videos on there in terms of how to start advanced care planning, explanations of the different aspects like advanced decisions to refuse treatment, or softer advanced care planning statements of wishes and preferences forms, or RBIT forms for people who are lacking capacity. It's all there. We've got all the All Wales documents on there. And yeah, this is the link to the /DNACPR All Wales document. We've switched that up recently. It looked pretty awful beforehand, but it's now on the NHS Collaborative website. I'm pleased to see. It doesn't take much to make me happy these days. And if you scroll down there a little bit, you've got a lovely video of me looking a bit red-faced in my office, talking about the policy updates for the new policy, which we updated for 2020, and the form as well. So oh yes, this is a busy slide, not particularly good. I'll just mention a few things from the key changes and clarifications for version 4. I listened to a lot of EP feedback. I listened a bit less of the ITU consultants' feedback. Don't tell them. But a lot of feedback here on the different areas. We expanded on the concept of natural, anticipated, and accepted death as a trigger to consider DNACPR discussions. DNACPR, CBR discussions with patients should be offered, especially if it is felt that talking about death and dying may be harmful. We've written offered here because it shouldn't be forced upon people either. I mean, I don't like policy documents that says every single patient who comes to this healthcare setting has to have a DNACPR and advanced care planning discussion forced onto them, because that is going to go wrong. If you kind of blanket approach everyone like that, it is going to lead to mistrust and misinformation. It is an offer of a conversation, and I sometimes go in saying, look, I'd like to talk to you about something not everyone likes to talk about. But I'm going to talk to you about this topic. Stop me if you want to. Not everyone likes to talk about it, and then I kind of carry on the conversation. It's an offer. It's not a tick box must exercise that you must fulfill. I'm getting a bit of feedback out of someone's living room. I don't know what they're up to, but it sounds like they're drinking some wine. That's great, by the way. So reiteration that blanket approaches to DNACPR are never acceptable, and each decision must be highly individualized to the person affected. And I always say this is a really major decision. I sometimes hear people saying, oh, but why do I have to do this, and why do I have to go and see the patient and sign, etc., etc. No, DNACPR is a really big deal, and it's not just like filling in your next X-ray request or blood form or the things that we do. It is a major deal in someone's healthcare. clarification on who can hold these discussions and who can sign Section 5. I'll talk a little bit more about this one later. Oh, here's a good one. This is one that I get a lot of queries about, that nursing homes and care homes phone the GP practice and say, oh, they come from their home, and in the nursing home now, the DNACPR form has their home address on it, so you have to rewrite the whole DNACPR form to put the care home address on it. Complete bunkum, complete nonsense, and we've made that very clear in the policy that you don't have to do that. It is not appropriate. If you want to, you can change the address details on a fresh DNACPR form, but this is not a trigger to write and have a whole renewed conversation about it. And I talk in this a little bit as well about the need for who signs box 5 and who signs box 6, the senior responsible clinician, and clarification on who and what the senior responsible clinician do. Now, I get a lot of questions about this one. A lot of people say, oh, but does it have to be signed by a senior responsible clinician? Can't it just be box 5 signed off, etc., by the SHO or by someone else? And yes, that is true. You can't, if you turn the question around and you say, if I had a DNACPR form in front of me and I arrived in a situation where a patient had collapsed and their heart and breathing had stopped, and if merely box 5 had been filled in and had been merely filled in by an SHO, I would still abide by it. It's still a document that forms part of the healthcare record and is still important. However, the recommendation in the policy is that as soon as possible, the senior responsible clinician countersigns it, looks at it, and has certain responsibilities as well, including the dissemination. So, for instance, if an out-of-hours GP has had a wonderful conversation with the patient, and the patient has sort of entrusted with them and said to the out-of-hours GP, look, I'm really frightened of receiving CPR. If I stay here at home, I don't want to have it. And the out-of-hours clinician fills in a DNACPR form and it stays in the patient's home. Then I'd say the senior responsible clinician, in this case, the general practitioner, when informed about this, it would make sense for them to countersign that form and be cited on that form. And then some of the responsibilities include dissemination to the wider team as well, because the GP is often at the heart of it. Now, I'm starting to sound increasingly form obsessive, and really I'm not, and I'm often the biggest critic of the form, and even the newly designed form I've got some issues with. But it's I'd like to reiterate that it's a lot of it is about the conversations and the good conversations in this. I have been very concerned by senior coroners in England and other places as well, making sweeping statements like, when a patient is found in a nursing home or community setting and they don't have a DNACPR form, then CPR must be commenced in every circumstance. It's complete nonsense. It's complete rubbish. And actually, the General Medical Council and the Nursing and Midwifery Council and even the WAST ambulance service in Wales have made it very clear that in a situation where it is clear that CPR will not work, you do not have to give CPR, even in the absence of a DNACPR form or other such form. And so loud was the noise during the start of the COVID pandemic that we actually wrote a letter, which you may have seen. It was sent out on the 28th of March, went to all the Wales medical directors, nursing directors, and Welsh Ambulance Service as well, where we made it clear that clinicians at the cold face of clinical decision-making should not perform CPR that will not work and that will cause harm to the patient, resuscitators, and bystanders, even if no DNACPR decision has been reached in advance. They should be supported in deciding not to do so. Such a decision should be rapidly discussed with fellow attendees at the scene of an acute deterioration where there is no DNACPR or advanced care plan form in place, agreed and recorded very clearly in contemporaneous notes. It's complete nonsense, this whole notion of everyone needs to, no one can die without a form, and I'm very clear on that. Yeah, a little snapshot of the newer DNACPR form. So some things have changed. For instance, it says now a summary must be filled in. There's nothing worse than a of incompletely filled DNACPR form. And I think at least write in what has been discussed, and the person who reads this form in 2 or 3 weeks' time will have much more confidence that a discussion actually has been held and what the content of that discussion was. And the same goes in for the discussion with the relatives or with the IMCA or the next of kin as well, a little bit lower down. Another change is, if you look in section 5, is that can now be signed by HCPC holders, so allied healthcare professionals. This was, I consulted fairly widely with colleagues in Scotland for the All Scotland DNACPR policy, and also colleagues throughout England. And in Scotland, senior physiotherapists and senior paramedics are signing these forms. And we felt that we're in a world now where when such conversations happen, they should be recorded. We had one situation where a reasonably senior nurse on the ward was very trusted by a patient. The patient was palliative, and the patient said, "Look, Alison, I'd like to talk to you about something. I really don't want to have CPR." And that nurse kind of sort of said, "Oh, I've got to stop you there. I'm not allowed to have these conversations. I'll get the doctor to do it." She tried to contact the doctor, couldn't get hold of them, went off shift, forgot about it. And that moment was lost, unfortunately, because she felt it wasn't her responsibility and that she shouldn't, that she needn't be involved. And unfortunately, a week later, that patient deteriorated and didn't have a DNACPR form. So you can imagine what happened. And it's very sad when such moments are lost. So we've been very clear that these forms can be filled in by allied healthcare staff as well. And we've made very clear what sort of training requirements are in the All Wales policy for these situations. A bit further down, senior responsible clinician with oversight to sign. So that box, the best DNACPR forms, I feel, are the ones where box 5 and box 6 have been signed. Makes it so in all the feedback we had, people felt more comfortable with that. It gave a more multi-level approach so that different clinicians had seen this. And ideally, in some circumstances, we'd be seeing more and more interdisciplinary mix on the form. So you might have, a senior community CNS fill in section 5 of the form, and then the GP or a consultant in palliative medicine assigning section 6 of the form. And those forms are often the best in terms of the sort of the veracity. So if someone comes in and looks at the form, they've got immediate confidence that this is the right thing. If you turn the form around, then the patient, if they look at it, they can read it, and they can read a lot of the detail about what is sort of summarized from the whole policy in very brief, but also a link, a website link, which you can't see very well on this, wales.nhs.uk/DNACPR, where the policy and all the patient information, resources, leaflets, and videos are shared. And the sharing and involving leaflet, the blue one that you probably still recognize and still have, is still valid. And we've got lots of resources, including sign language and for people with sight difficulties. There's an audio as well. Some of the other updates in there, training on DNACPR, including a lot of the ESR resources that we've put out there. Advice on offering second opinions when CPR is expected by patients. Further information on the message in a green bottle scheme that some of you will know, which is still very much running with Welsh Ambulance. And if when the Welsh language version of the form is preferred, an English language copy must be appended to ensure that any healthcare professionals like myself, I'm learning Welsh, German, but I am learning Welsh, but I think I would struggle with a fully filled in Welsh language DNACPR form. If I came into that situation, an English language form must be there as well for good communication, in a sense, for everyone. Yeah, and a bit of clarification on cross-border forms. So if you have a respect form fluttering in, what that means, and still a valid part of the clinical record, but if the patient is staying longer in Wales, then I would tend to fill in an All Wales DNACPR form. And sometimes I actually append the old respect form at the back of that. Advanced and future care planning resources for Wales. So really important. That sort of, I mentioned earlier, I was going to tell you a little anecdote about a patient of mine. MND patient who in 2010 lamented the fact that when she had looked that there was no All Wales advanced decision to refuse treatment form, and she was right. There was a few documents by Macmillan and various others in England, but nothing that was particularly bespoke, and she wanted something that was recognisable in Wales, recognisable by the Welsh Ambulance Service, for instance. So we provided all that. It's all on wales.nhs.uk/AFCP, Advanced and Future Care Planning. A lot of the documents and the information was informed by a big Advanced and Future Care Planning conference that we organized back in the heady days of 2019 when we were all still able to get together. Which had a lot of patient and carer involvement, including people with other conditions, so not just cancer, but also sort of renal conditions. This is the All Wales Advanced Decision to Refuse Treatment form that is available on this site, and there's some guidance to go with it. So you can see it's got an NHS Wales logo on it and a WAST logo on it as well. There's the guidance to go with it as well, also bilingual, so a guidance document to walk people through that process. And I really hope that we could recommend people to take things into their own hands a little bit, especially sort of quite informed patients who want to do this, and this kind of walks them through that process a little bit. Yeah, so that's the link to the All Wales DNACPR policy site. The training videos on talkcpr.wales and on YouTube as well. And we've also got videos on advancedcareplan.org.uk, which you might find useful. Brief thing on the recent CQC England inquiry in light of COVID. CQC did not find much evidence of blanket decision making, in fact, for whole categories of patients care settings during COVID-19, but did warn against that practice. It found that about a third of DNACPR decisions had been inadequately discussed with patients and their kin, and documentation of discussions was lacking. There's an interesting sort of few backstories from England where the respect form is being used a lot, where apparently the respect form was inadequately explained. There was probably some woolly explanations that didn't quite amount to using the words DNACPR. In Wales, we have the DNACPR form. This is what it says on the tin. You can't exactly leave it at someone's house without explaining it pretty well. Otherwise, you'll get into major trouble. Whereas perhaps the respect form leaves a bit of ambiguity there. So relatives were finding these respect forms and complaining heavily, and they had a huge amount of complaints about the respect form. So there's advantages to it, there's disadvantages to it as well. And they also find the staff knowledge on this area was very patchy. Some of the legal aspects are quite complicated, as you've probably heard in the last hour or so. And that public understanding was very poor as well. So lots of people still talk about signing their own DNACPR. I was asked by the doctor to sign my own DNACPR form, which of course we know is incorrect. You sign your own ADRT, but you don't sign your own DNACPR form. And yeah, if you're interested in this topic, I've written quite widely about this, but some interesting cultural differences as well that we've come across. You know, for instance, with patients from different parts of the world and how they approach these things. There's perhaps sometimes more skepticism about these things, or a query whether within Islamic law, for instance, it is allowed to have these forms or not. And it is, and we've looked into this. So yes, so that just for interest purposes. The lovely art students in Falmouth who helped me out with some of these resources created this poster for me as well, Endless Hope, Hopeless End. I hope you don't find this a hopeless end. And thank you very much for listening on this Wednesday evening, and I hope you found some of this stuff useful in a session today. So back to Nimish, and I'm sure there's probably lots of questions, so fire away.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was really interesting. Mark, yeah, there's a couple of questions in the side chat bar. So I think you may have answered some of these. So one's, if you have a DNA CPR form completed in secondary care and the patient then moves to the community or a nursing home, do they need a new form?
I mean, it depends on how good and how confident you are in the readability of the form that has come from the hospital. I sometimes say that you look at the form that has come through, and if you're happy to scan it onto your GP records and it's legible and you can understand it, then that is fine. If it is illegible, then I would tend to write a new one, but I would append the old form to the previous one, and I would quote the discussion that has been previously held. And if there's a question mark about that discussion, and we sometimes get forms come from the community where we're not quite sure as well what's been written, I pick up the phone to the GP or to whoever might have filled it in, and I sort of say, look, what level of discussion did you have here with family and with the patient? And then get a bit of clarification. And then I write that information in great detail onto the form. So like you, Nimish, I write a lot of detail onto these forms because I know that people in the out-of-hours setting and then later on in a few weeks' time will be very grateful of that. And I know you write a fair bit on these forms as well.
So just following on from that, are you saying that you don't need to have a discussion with the patient again if you have a discussion with the person? You're just rewriting the form a bit clearer?
No, I mean, it's individualize it, but some patients feedback that they fed up with having million DNA CPR discussions with different clinicians, and if you're confident that a good discussion has been held, then, well, sometimes what I do is I acknowledge it and say, oh, I see you have a DNA CPR form here, and that's been discussed with you in the hospital, and they're likely to raise that if they have any further queries about it or it's not their head, but they don't necessarily want to discuss it again. So no, it doesn't have to be discussed again. The whole point of having an all Wales DNA CPR policy is that the form can travel, and that if you're confident that that form is still valid and that the conversation was a good one, then it still stands.
This sort of ties in similarly. There was a Macmillan nurse that had a DNA CPR discussion with a palliative care patient, and then sent a message to the GP saying complete the official form. And GP at the time, Gillian, was feeling that it's a bit inappropriate because the Macmillan nurses already had the discussion. They're being asked to fill the form out. Is that appropriate?
Yeah, it depends really. I mean, it depends on the confidence of that Macmillan nurse you can't force someone to fill in the form with a patient and then to sign it. But the DNA CPR policy in Wales certainly makes it clear that that Macmillan nurse can sign it in section 5 of the form, and then should inform the GP. In fact, during COVID, we even put a clause into the DNA CPR policy. The nurse can phone the GP or communicate with the GP saying, look, I'm in the nursing home, I'm discussing this, I've discussed it with the patient, they don't want CPR, I've had a really good conversation with them, I've documented that discussion. Section 6 of the form, you can sort of not sign remotely, but you can write in section 6 of the form where the senior responsible clinician goes that you phoned them and they are in agreement, and then they can say, look, Nimish, what is your GMC number? I'm going to fill it in and put it on the GMC bit in section 6. Are you happy with that? And you discuss it with them, and either you're happy or you're not happy, and then you can carry on, and then you don't have to go to that nursing home on the Friday evening. I mean, I would tend to say that it's good practice then to go back at a later point and review it and actually sign it properly, but the person who is in the nursing home can have a discussion with you and then sign it on your behalf and write that they've telephoned you and discussed it.
There's another question here about a DNA CPR form completed in a hospital in England, and they haven't got a formal form. So if that's already been completed, it's been discussed obviously with the patient next of kin. When they come over, say if they're discharged to a nursing home in Wales, sometimes we get the nursing home saying we need the Welsh one. That's what's valid. Is that?
Yeah, I tend to do that. So if a respect form comes over or an English DNA CPR form sort of comes over, I would say you don't want any. The English form or the respect form is still valid and is still an important part of the healthcare record, and you wouldn't dismiss it, but you want to avoid that the healthcare staff member says, "Oh, I have to ignore this because it's an English form and is not valid here." So for good communication reasons, I would tend to sort of fill in a new form. I wouldn't go through the whole process again necessarily. I wouldn't put the patient through it necessarily and say, "Oh, we have to have this discussion again," unless I feel it's appropriate. But I would fill in a form and say, on that form I would write. So I'd get the All Wales policy. I'd write the form, and then I'd reference the fact that that I've seen the England form or the Respect form, and I'll quote that and I'll reference that, and then I'll put today's date in. So that's what I would do. And sometimes I append the original form to the new All Wales DNACPR form. And photocopies are fine, by the way, everyone. Don't worry, but I prefer a good photocopy of a DNACPR form to a really crappy, the carbon copies of things that you can sort of barely read. I can always read yours, Nimish, because you write really hard on the DNACPR form, but a lot of them you can't read. So a decent photocopy is still a valid medical document.
Mark, there's one question left, and we've got 1 minute left, which is perfect.
Oh,
so
okay.
If an out-of-hours doctor completes a DNACPR form, should they be asked the usual GP to countersign it?
I think that's good practice. Yeah, I think so. If an out-of-hours GP does that, then clearly the patient has had a discussion with them. They've talked it through. Maybe the family have even been there. They've had a good talk about it. It would be good to leave the form at the home, but then also transfer a copy of the form to the GP practice. And I'd say, yeah, it would be good practice to countersign that, or for the GP on Monday or Tuesday to go in. If they can't find the form, then to write a new DNACPR form, and just say initial discussion held with out-of-hours GP on the 18th of the 5th, 2021, basically, and reference that conversation.
That's perfect. Mark, thank you very much for a really interesting and stimulating talk and discussion. Thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thank you all. Have a pleasant evening, and we'll see you
Bye-bye.
in our next webinar soon.